All right, let's try that. Can you hear me now? All right, the sound. I switched the microphone. Let's see if that's working now. Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up. Is good now. Thank you, Grace. Colleen, hi. Yes, I see your comment. Fantastic. So for some reason, every time I log in, the input, the audio input seems to be different. Not sure why that is, but it seems like you can hear me now. So great. So what I was saying for that minute or two while nobody could hear me is that many questions came in last week. Fantastic questions, great questions with a lot of depth and that are relevant to so much of what we're doing, so much of what we're talking about. So we will try to get through as many of these as possible. It may go over an hour. Let's see. Let's see what happens. I do like to answer as many as possible because otherwise those perturbations, those doubts stay there, and that influences what we see and how we perceive and how we think about and experience this. So let's see if we can answer them all. If it goes more than an hour, let's see. So let's jump right in. Let's just take a moment to pause here together. Thank you for being here. The first question is about the ego and the nature of the ego. And there were many questions about this. So let's talk about the structure of I and its relationship with the ego. Right? We've talked in detail about the three minds. Briefly, what we're saying is that this I, this sense of identity, falls across a spectrum. Right? The sense of identity, the sense of who I am, the sense of what I am, right? Not as a thought, not as reasoning, not as an emotion, but the fundamental feeling, what I am, where I begin, where I end, falls across a spectrum. And in the first mind, it's localized, it's within a body, it feels like it's within a personality. The second mind is of the nature of what we are calling consciousness, meaning that it is not restricted to a lifetime or a body or these kinds of physical and mental restrictions. And yet it expresses also as the body and the personal mind and the objects of the world, right? That's also I. So the I has shifted from being identified with strictly the body or the personal mind to this non-local domain. And then the third mind is consciousness itself without modification, right? Where are the three minds? They're all right here. It is just that the world is perceived differently according to the configuration of the mind. So from that perspective, is the ego bad was one of the questions, right? Its relationship with the ego, the sense of identity. Well, this ego is in play as the first mind, that boundary of the first mind, right? This is me and that is not me. And I am the one doing these things. And, I want to do this, therefore I do this. I don't want to do this, therefore I don't do this. This sense that all of what we are doing, all of what is happening in terms of my own personal world is from my own volition and my own sense of identity. This is that first mind. Now, that same ego is still there as the second mind. However, the difference is that it has been seen through. It is not hard, it is not concrete, and it is not as limiting. All right? Remember that to express anything, to do anything, there has to be some sense of ego. There has to be some sense that something is happening, that there is an association with the body, right? That we are speaking English, for example, right? That is only expressed through some kind of identity. If no sense of localizing identity is there, there is no ability to express, right? So the ego has been traditionally, in some traditions, considered a quote-unquote bad thing, only because it limits perception. Perception in terms of the perceptual world and the things around us, and also perception of what we are. All right, so this ego is not that it's bad, it is by its nature limiting. And because of that, it can cause suffering. And because of not being able to see what's going on, it's kind of like stumbling around in a dark room. Right? So that is the sense in which the ego has been made bad through a lot of stories. It is not that the ego is actually bad, because without any ego, there is no expression in the world. So that very same sense of identity can be functioned through where the primary identity is no longer localized as that ego, and yet can express through it, through the abilities or the talents or functions of that so-called ego, right? So part of this is moving away from vilifying the ego. Another question is, how do we get away from I? How do we get away from I? Well, if we look at the structure of I, it is not really about getting away from I. It's about seeing the nature of what I am. There's no way to get away from I. What is meant here, likely, in this question, is to get away from the constricted feeling of what I am. In other words, how do we see through the first mind? See through meaning see through the boundaries, see beyond that first mind perspective. This is really what's being asked, right? And we've talked about this before, the strategy or the mechanisms of doing that. So that can be reviewed in the previous episodes and in the other series on the three minds. But it's not getting away from I, it's seeing beyond or moving beyond only the first mind feeling, the first mind sense of I, right? The nature of I changes. That's why in spiritual traditions, they often say, I am, right? I am. In some traditions, they say, I am that I am, or I am the reality. This I, it's not getting away from that I, but this I that says I am is a different I. It's a different spectrum, a different range of the identity than the I that says I am Anoop, right? The root of the I is the same, but the I that is expressing is different. So you can look at it as ranges on a mountain, right? The peak, or the part that is very apparent on the outside, is the individual I, the individual body, the personal thoughts, etc. But as one goes deeper into what it is that I am, the nature of that I changes. It's no longer sharp, it's no longer pointed, it's no longer well delineated and separate from everything else. So let's take a pause here. And bring your awareness to the foreground. Allow the reflections and the thoughts to integrate. So let's talk about the notion of perfection. Someone sent a message or a video about perfection. So what we're talking about here is not about being perfect, right? That's another kind of self-judgment. It's another kind of saying that I have to be better, right? What has to be better? Who has to be better? This first mind has to be better. The first mind can acquire skills and be better with certain skills, right? It can be a better runner. It can be a better teacher, depending on the subject. But what we're talking about here as the three minds is not about fundamentally being better. It's about recognizing that what we are is perfect. Because what we are is not only this first mind. So this isn't about becoming perfect. If at all there is a role for perfection, it's in recognizing that perfection is already our nature. Right? It's not about becoming perfect. I always thought that some of the best advice that I heard as a kid is be yourself. Right? Be yourself. It's a profound statement. What does it really mean to be oneself? So even greater than some notion of perfection is being oneself. Yes, there can be a first mind experience. Yes, there can be a second mind experience. Yes, there is a third mind. And all this is I. All this is the nature of I appearing in different ways. All right? This recognition, this being okay with this, that relaxation itself starts to dissolve that boundary of the first mind. All right, so not about perfection, about being oneself, which is more than enough. Is this about losing the personality or the first mind? I think we've talked about this now. It should be more clear now. All right, it's not about losing it. It's about using it, in a sense. Meaning that it's about actually recognizing it. In the first mind configuration, the first mind itself is not generally seen, right? When we're so identified with something, we can't even recognize it, right? It's like trying to see something that's so close to us. If the hand is so close to the face, you can't see the hand because it's stuck to us so closely. There's some distance, right? That's required to see it. So it's not about losing the first mind. It's about recognizing, aha, here's this experience, here's this configuration, here is this boundary of this first mind. That recognition itself is shifting the nature of identity. So seeing it as what it is, functioning through it, right? This subtle first mind is an aspect of this second mind. We can say it that way. When that boundary is completely dissolving, such that the boundaries are no longer recognized, and there is no ability to function, no world to speak of, because that boundary itself is what is superimposed on this potential, which then appears as what we call a world. So it's not about losing the first mind. Let's pause here and integrate all of this. All right. Is the second mind the witness? Is the second mind the same as the witness? No, it's not the same as the witness. The witness is a very useful state in which attention is no longer glued onto a particular thing. Right? So the witness is that attention or that awareness in which the world of objects is seen, including the body as an object. right? The body itself is recognized as an object, as are all other objects. This is the witness state. And this is a very useful state because it starts to loosen and give the experience of a different sense of identity. Right? This is the witness. And the purpose of this is exactly that. It's to start recognizing that there are other levels, other kinds, other layers of this thing called I am, or what I am, or who I am. In a way, this witness state is the peak of duality. Because the experience is, there is what I am, this consciousness or this awareness, and then there is this world of objects, right? There's a very clear distinction as the witness. What is witness after all? If I witness a scene, if I witness something happening, it is an observer noting the observed. This is the witnessing, right? In this case, it is the awareness noting the world, including that sense of individuality. Now, this is different. This is en route to the second mind being established, right? The second mind is when that witnessing awareness and that which is witnessed collapse unto each other, right? When that subject-object framework integrates, right? And it's not an all or nothing phenomenon, but it's that range in which the subject and object integrate, right? So I am appearing as these processes, right? There's no language to really put it precisely because language itself is generally a first mind derivation. But experience that witness, right? Let's take a moment to witness. So if there is the experience of witnessing, now notice that in this witnessing, there is a witness witnessing the witnessed, right? ED at the end. There is an observer observing the observed, right? So this tripartite relationship between the witness that is witnessing the witnessed, this integrates. These three pieces integrate. And this is the beginning of the second mind, right? In which this fundamental kind of duality, this peak of duality, the witnessing and the witnessed, the observer and the observed, have collapsed. And here, what was the personal mind, what was the first mind, becomes still. This is the beginning of the end of the monkey mind, the so-called monkey mind, which refers only to that active state of the first mind and not the mind as a whole. So witnessing is a road to the second mind. So here's a very practical question. Can this be effective with mental illness, depression, anxiety, manic depression, etc.? If so, how? So this is an important question. Now, I am a physician, obviously, and I can't give medical advice, so I want to be clear about that, because every situation is different. So I can't give medical advice about this. I'll make some general comments, right? So what are we talking about when we say mental illness? What does this really mean, mental illness? You'll see when we start to look at this, the understanding starts to break down. Because first of all, to define mental illness, we have to define the mind. Mental illness is illness of the mind. But then what is the mind? In medical science, well, in general, there is no real definition of the mind. It's kind of a vague feeling, right, in medical science, in general in society. But so when we're talking about illness of the mind, what is that mind? It's generally understood as the first mind in medical science. Even though there's no clear definition, the general feel of what the mind is that it is the first mind. Now the thing is, when we talk about an illness of that mind, what we're generally referring to is some kind of suffering that is due to either perceptions or thoughts or feelings that we think should not be there. Right? I'm giving a very layman's, understandable, straightforward definition of what it might be. When we talk about mental illness, we're talking about suffering, some kind of suffering that's happening, right? Determined by someone's ideas, some kind of suffering that's happening due to perceptions, thoughts, feelings that we think should not be in that way, should not be happening in that way. Now, here's the key part of it. It's something that should not be happening in that way. The problem is that when the mind is defined as the first mind only, there is no broader context for what is happening. Right? Does that make sense? There's no broader context. It's like if two people were traveling up a mountain and they're starting from different paths, and at some point their paths intersect, and let's say they stop at this intersection of paths and they rest, and one person says, you know, the terrain has been really tough. This area seems pretty nice compared to what it's been. And the other person says, no, actually the terrain's been pretty easy. This area seems pretty tough compared to where I've been. So each one is speaking about where they are relative to where they have been. And now as they continue up this mountain and reach the top, when they look back down, they'll look at that resting place and they'll see what the other person meant. They'll say that, oh, I see, on your journey, that place felt this way because of the terrain you had covered, right? On my journey, it felt this way, it appeared this way because of the terrain I had covered. So similarly, in terms of the mind, the range of mind that we are experiencing is part of a broader range. Now the question is, how does that mind develop? What is that mind's path up the mountain? Without seeing that broader path, it's very difficult to intervene in a holistic way, to manage what's happening in a holistic way, right? So from a programmatic approach, the answer is yes, it can be effective. However, for it to be effective, this nature of this mind has to be seen, and that's difficult when the prevailing paradigm is a materialist paradigm. All right, because there's no way to separate this, the nature of the mind and what's considered wellness and illness, from the broader picture of what is happening. Right, the broader course of a lifetime, and to be frank, the broader course of lifetimes, plural. Without that broad vision, it can be very easy to misinterpret what is happening within a certain period of time, whether it's days, months, years. So it can be applied, however, it requires a much broader perspective. All right. Generally speaking, to know that all states of mind are leading somewhere, this can be helpful. All states of mind are leading somewhere, right? And there's nothing fundamentally wrong with any person. This is about using certain strategies to help relax that mind, This actually reminds me of another question here, which is, how do I get out of the dark night of the soul? Let's pause here for a second. How do I get out of the dark night of the soul? Now, this dark night of the soul, from looking at the mechanism itself, it is that shifting from the first to the second mind. It's an especially difficult period of transition because the vision is not yet beyond that first mind perspective, right? And yet the stories are crumbling. The stories of what works, the stories of who I am or what I should be or what my life is about. All of these stories are starting to crumble. Emotions that have been repressed or suppressed for a long time are starting to break through. So it's like being in the spin cycle, right? And perhaps more than anything else, the dark night of the soul is characterized by the feeling of not being able to do anything about it, right? Let's be frank about that and straightforward about that. There's no strategy or easy way out of the dark night of the soul. The very process of something breaking has a rhythm to it, right? Even the very simple process of cracking an egg and letting the egg out, letting the yolk out, right? There's a process to that cracking. First, it cracks in one place. The crack spreads around the egg slowly, right? Sometimes it cracks quickly. Sometimes it cracks all the way. So the cracking itself has its own rhythm, has its own process. And in the dark night of the soul, that first mind is cracking. All right. So I don't want to suggest that there is some technique or some strategy to get out of the dark night of the soul, simply because that is what the dark night of the soul is. It is that challenging period. However, what I can say is that every person who has been through this shift has experienced what you have experienced. If you are experiencing the dark night right now, know that you are not alone. You're not alone in the sense that there are many other people also experiencing the same right now. And not only that, there are millions, there are untold numbers that have experienced it, right? Who have broken down, who have been disillusioned, right? Disillusion meaning experiencing that pain and also experiencing that joy. The pain and the joy go together, though they may not be felt at the same time. All right? You're not alone. You will get through this. The very nature is the feeling that I cannot get through this. I, this first mind, cannot get through this. I, this first mind, am totally lost. I, this first mind, am spinning. This is that nature of the dark night. And others are with you on this journey. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. All right. Let's talk about mind and heart. This is a question that comes up often. What about the heart? Right? When we're talking about the minds, the three minds, what about the heart? So this idea that the heart and the mind are different, or this experience of the heart being different from the mind, is only when the mind is defined as the first mind. Right? If the mind is thoughts, personal thoughts, if the mind is these personal ideas, concepts, then the heart is different. As the second mind, the mind is no longer what we call thoughts. It can also appear as that. Right? The mind is no longer only emotion. The mind is of the nature of consciousness in the second mind configuration. And it is differentiating as the world, as what we call the world in the first mind. So heart and mind are integrated as the second mind. All right, so that mind is the first mind that's often referred to as the monkey mind. It's different from the heart. The first mind conceptualizes things and so on. In the second mind, all of these are integrated. And this is what is distinct about the second mind, is that all particularities are dissolving. So that feeling of expansion that is attributed to the heart, the feeling of connectedness, the feeling of oneness, the feeling of love, all of these are of the nature of the second mind. The heart that is open and overflowing encompasses the mind, that first mind. It drowns that first mind. Similarly, the mind that is clear and is losing its boundary encompasses the heart, right? They meet. Then thinking isn't happening with just the mind. Feeling isn't happening with just the heart. It is a total systemic experience. All right. Where do all the other bad thoughts come from? So where do thoughts come from in general? Thoughts come from either an incomplete perception of what's happening, or from the desire to rearrange and modify what is happening. So the human being, in viewing the world in a particular way, right? If that vision or experience is incomplete, the nature of the human being is to start asking, what is this? What is that? How does this connect to that? Right? These kinds of thoughts start to arise because the vision and the experience of what is happening is incomplete. And so that desire to understand, desire to know, desire to integrate. Or if the vision is clear, then it can be to create some kind of change in the world, right? To connect one idea with another, or to plan a series of steps. These are the conditions in which thought happens. And you will see that the majority of thoughts in the world are recycled and shared among the population. The majority of thoughts. This is what media and advertising is about, right? It's about taking thoughts that are already there and recirculating them. And we are a kind of media unto ourselves, hearing someone else's thoughts and repeating those thoughts, right? So thoughts themselves are generally recycled among people. And where do they come from? Like I said, they're for two uses. Either they're unconsciously just being recycled, but they're creations, they're created because of an incomplete perception of what's happening, or a desire to rearrange what is happening. Now, bad thoughts, I'm not sure what this means. Where do bad thoughts come from? I'm not sure what a bad thought is. Right? Maybe there's a story saying these kinds of thoughts are not good. We should not have these kinds of thoughts. Right? As the attention is shifted beyond these stories of good and bad, then the power and the effect of these stories will fall away. All right? So the good and the bad comes from somebody else's idea of what is good and what is bad. Right? That now I have taken on, and now I am believing that these thoughts are good and these are bad. Right? Instead, we can simply see which are the useful ones. Which thoughts are useful for who I am and what I am? Which thoughts are not useful? Right? The ones that are not useful, discard them. Right? And if it's difficult to discard them, this is where the practice of the three minds comes in, which we've discussed in previous episodes. So moving away from the idea of good thoughts and bad thoughts towards the recognition of that which is useful and that which is not. That which is being endlessly repeated by the society that is not really helpful to me right now. And maybe these few thoughts which are really helpful. All right. We're only about halfway in. Someone said, I need to put in better effort and I don't know how. So this really depends on what the state of that mind is. Right? Is the mind overwhelmed and feeling, I need to put in more effort, I need to put in better effort? If it's overwhelmed, then what to do in that moment is to simply say that this story is not serving me. Right? I need to put in more effort, I need to put in more effort. This is just overwhelming the mind even more. So there we can recognize, some space starts to come as we recognize, wait a second, this very idea that I need to do more is itself causing me suffering. And if that's true, it's just time to pause that story and question it. Is it really true I need to do more? Isn't it this very thought? Isn't it this very idea that I need to do more that's causing me suffering? Right? That's one approach. Now it could be that the mind is quiet, not overwhelmed, but quiet, and saying, I need to do more. There's something else. If that mind is quiet, then that's the time for meditation. That's a time for collecting the rays of the mind and bringing them within. Right? So that's the course of action for the mind that is quiet and saying, I need to do more, which will be different than the mind that is overwhelmed and saying, I need to do more. Now there's another one, which is the mind that is very active. Right? It's not overwhelmed, it's just very active. And it feels very strongly, I need to do more. I need to do more. I have the energy, I need to do more. So when it's like that, then it's time to give the body some work to do. Right? Because there's so much energy that it's difficult to regulate it and difficult to bring it to a point of reflection. So let the work perform, let the body perform work. Right? Whether it's playing sports, whether it's doing something outside, whatever it is, let the body work out that energy until the mind starts to become quieter and it can be tuned towards reflection. So depending on the state of the mind that is saying, I need to do more, I need to put in more effort. The next course of action, the next step will be different. Bring your awareness to the front. We've got a lot of ideas coming out. Is the superconscious mind a myth? No. Of course, what that is depends on how we're talking about it. I would say that the first mind is the subconscious mind. Generally, we talk about the subconscious as that which I cannot remember. Right? I cannot remember something, or it's in my memory somewhere. It's subconscious. But one could also say that this first mind, owing to its boundary, is the subconscious mind, because it is not aware of the nature of consciousness, and it's not aware of the nature of its identity. Right? And identity is that linchpin which either locks or unlocks everything. The entire universe rests on the tip of the needle of identity. So the second mind is the conscious mind, or we can call it the superconscious mind. This is the question, right? Is the superconscious mind a myth? No. Subconscious, conscious mind, and consciousness. The third mind is consciousness. The second mind is the conscious mind. And the first mind is a subconscious mind. We co-create our reality. So how can we transform myself and karma? We co-create our reality, so how can I transform myself and my karma? So when we say we co-create our reality, what is the we that co-creates? Certainly first minds, all individuals as first minds are co-creating this world. All right, a very plain example is if we want to create a house or a building, many first minds are working together to create that. But even more generally, the thoughts and the feelings of the first minds together can create the feeling of the society, the thoughts of the society, the beliefs and the policies of the society. However, these thoughts, these expressions of the first mind themselves are expressions of that deeper consciousness, right? It is this undifferentiated consciousness that is appearing as though these particularities and these particular stories, beliefs, thoughts, etc. So when we say we are co-creating, remember the structure of identity. We as first minds, right? At the outer level of identity. At the middle level of identity, we as consciousness expressing as these minds. At the deepest layer of identity, we as consciousness itself. So this we that co-creates has many layers to it. So what we talk about as karma generally, karma is that which is experienced by this first mind. Right? The actions of the past that have created certain effects that are being born right now. The effects are starting to express right now. This world of karma is generally experienced by the first mind. So if I, as the first mind, feel that I am creating this and I am not doing this and then I'm doing this, I am completely entangled in this wheel of karma. Because after all, it's me doing this and me choosing this and I made this happen, and I failed, and I succeeded, and now I am in this wheel because the identity is caught there. And so all the effects and repercussions of karma are experienced, right? It's like the waves in the ocean dashing against the sides of the boat, this way and that way and this way and that way, because the identity is localized and confined at that level. Now, as the second mind, the effects of that karma are much less, right? For two reasons. Number one, because the identity is not fixed there, the results of prior actions, the karma that is being expressed now, the karma that is coming to fruition now, is at that level of the first mind. Karma is not at the level of consciousness itself, right? So it's like the difference between, let's say, the skin being pierced by a needle and being tapped by a needle, right? There's still an experience. However, the experience is not as strong because the identity is no longer restricted, right? So that's one reason. So whatever waves are striking the side of the boat, the identity is no longer restricted to the boat. So that karma is experienced differently. Secondly, because the identity is not restricted, the new karma being created is not like that of the first mind, right? The feeling is no longer, as the second mind, that I, the individual, is doing this, or I, the individual, is doing that. I, the individual, failed. I, the individual, succeeded. That feeling is not there as the second mind, right? And therefore, that new karma is not being created as it is in the first mind. Right? So the next question was, does karma only exist in the first mind? It's not that it only exists in the first mind. Is that the experience of it is primarily felt as the first mind. As the second mind, that experience is not the same, and that intensity is not the same, because the identity and volition is not the same. This is a subtle point. Keep the awareness here. This awareness which is always here. Can we work on our karma from past lives? Yes. The restriction to a lifetime is within the first mind. As the boundary of identity is no longer restricted to this particular body, this particular personality, these particular tendencies, then as that second mind, consciousness is not restricted to a lifetime. Right? The feeling, if indeed our nature is not restricted to a lifetime, right? If that's the case, this is our hypothesis that we are all exploring together. If it is the case that our nature is not restricted to a lifetime, nor a body, nor a personality, though we can function through these, it's not that we are not these things, but they are a function of what we are. If this is the case, then the feeling of that, the feeling of this nature, being restricted is one of angst or frustration or suffering, right? Simply because it's like if you were 6 feet tall and you were made to sit in a 3-foot box all day, it just wouldn't feel good. It's just the nature of boundaries, right? So this is what happens. Can we work on our karma from past lives? When that identity is no longer restricted, then what streams is not necessarily just the experiences of one lifetime. When I said streams, I'm making sure we're still streaming now. I think we are. Good. What streams as that second mind, through that second mind, is not necessarily only one particular lifetime. Because if the second mind is consciousness itself, then that awareness itself is an integrative process. All that needs to be integrated will be integrated as the second mind. It cannot be any other way. The second mind will not respect divisions as fundamental. Not because it wants to or doesn't want to, it's just the nature of that mind. It does not recognize divisions as fundamental, it recognizes divisions as superimposed. Which divisions? Any and all divisions, physical, mental, ideological, intellectual, whatever divisions are there, they are recognized as superimposed divisions, including the divisions of space and time, including the divisions that separate what we call lifetimes. And the second mind will integrate all apparent divisions. So it's in terms of working on karma, as the mind opens, as the identity relaxes into its more natural state, then the mind simply does what it does, right? All perceptions, all dimensions, whatever it is that needs to be integrated will start to stream. And it starts to integrate in and of itself. And to the extent that the personality is still active and doing things in the world, that personality will have to change or accommodate as this integrative process is happening. So what you eat might change, people you hang out with might change, activities might change, a lot of things may change because the second mind is at work doing what it does. It may be apparent, or initially it may not be apparent what is happening. And a lot of times it's not apparent because we don't have the stories to hold and describe what is actually happening. It feels like the first mind is part of the physical, and the second and third mind is where we cross over into the 2/3 of what we also are. What's your perspective about this? So I'll repeat the question. It feels like the first mind is part of the physical, and the second and third mind is where we cross over into the 2/3 of what we are. Right? So there's a fraction, there's a proportion being described here. 1/3 physical, 1/3 first mind, 1/3 second mind, 1/3 third mind. Something like this, right? 2/3 is the second and third, 1/3 is the first mind. So this proportion can be a kind of general guide from the first mind perspective, right? So we might say, for example, when I talk about the three minds, right, it's not really that it's one third, one third, one third. It can be initially a useful way to consider it. As we dive into it, however, from the second mind perspective, the first mind is not one third. It's a rather small fraction of what the mind is. I don't want to put a number on it, but it's an incredibly small fraction of what the mind is this first mind. Now, when that fraction is occupied, it seems huge. All right, that's just the nature of the mind. When I'm looking through that lens, everything I see is through that lens. And the world still seems huge. All of these ideas are still there. However, when that lens is seen through and that boundary starts dissolving, as the vision opens up, then it's recognized what was thought to be so huge is in fact a fraction of this mind. So the second mind is that oneness, that expansion, that relation of the ocean and the wave that we talked about. And the third mind is beyond size. There's no question of a fraction anymore. So the whole idea of fractions totally breaks down here. It's like even if we look at Earth as a whole, think about Earth, or why Earth. Consider the whole Milky Way, not just Earth, not just our solar system, but all of the systems in the Milky Way galaxy. Even if you look at the Milky Way galaxy, it's a pin. It's the head of a pin in the vast universe. This is the mind, where an entire galaxy is a pin. So where's the first mind perspective relative to that? Are we born with our perception intact? Are we born with our perception intact with the second and third minds? So this is the third mind. This, right? The third mind is not elsewhere, cannot be elsewhere. It is not subject to the ramifications of space and time. The second mind also is here, as consciousness itself, apparently differentiating as the various localities that might be experienced. So when we talk about being born, what do we really mean? It is the expression of consciousness as a particular body and personality, right? The apparent differentiation of consciousness as a particularity that we call bodying or minding. This is what we call, this is birth. This is what's described as birth from the first mind perspective, right? The bodying and minding of consciousness is what is called birth. So the entire spectrum of identity is always here, right? It is not that we are born with it. It is that it is being born as this process, right? Who is the we that is being born? It is this undifferentiated consciousness that is apparently flexing as a body and as a personal mind, right? The beauty of this is that we are this already. This is what we are right now. So in this, let's say, slice of space and time, that we call Earth. What is Earth? Earth, from the first mind perspective, is a physical location, right? With particular coordinates, can be coordinated in what we call outer space. This is the first mind perspective of Earth. The second mind perspective of Earth is a series of perceptions in a particular frame of space, right? Nobody has ever seen what we call Earth completely. Even an astronaut that sees the planet from space sees only one facet of what we call Earth. Why Earth? Even this hand. Nobody has seen this complete hand. What we call a hand can only be seen in one of its aspects. You are seeing one aspect, I'm seeing another. 1 million people situated around this hand would see 1 million different aspects of what we call hand, right? Because this fundamental thing that we interpret as hand is itself an appearance, is itself a projection which appears variously. So the first mind perspective of Earth, it's a physical, distinct thing. The second mind perspective is that it is a series of perceptions, right? So being born on Earth, for example, is a particular process in consciousness. So all that range of consciousness is always here. This is the beauty of this. There's nowhere to go for this. The entire range is always here. It's a matter of choosing the frame. We are past our hour mark. There are 2 more questions left, and we haven't gotten to the book yet. So if you have to jump off, no problem. You can come back to it. Let's finish this. These last 2 questions are subtle ones. And then we'll talk briefly. We'll start the chapter on love. We'll just read the initial part. The next chapter in the book, Is This a Dream? Is Love Shining? And let me just say a couple things before we go. One is, if you have the book, Is This a Dream? Please do leave a review on Amazon. I'm told by the publisher that it'll be good to have more reviews. So if you're able to leave a review on Amazon, please do that. The second thing is, before we get to these last 2 questions, there is a new membership starting on the Chopra Well, on the YouTube Chopra Well channel. And probably next week there will be lessons on there from Deepak Chopra, from world-renowned yoga teachers, and from myself. So I will be talking about a series called Gems of Ancient India, where we will take a text and dive into it and see what its relevance is today, what its relevance is in our own journey. So check, there should be a comment somewhere with this video. If you go to YouTube and go to the Chopra Well, there's an option to join the membership. So please do join, and I will see you there live next week. This session will continue. We will still do Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. So let's move on with these last 2 questions. This is a long one. So does awareness equal consciousness equal timeless, formless existence equal bliss? Basically, are these all synonyms? Awareness, consciousness, timeless, formless existence? The easy answer is yes. The easy answer is yes. As long as you understand that in particular contexts, these can mean different things. Consciousness in particular is a notoriously slippery word, right? Used in philosophy one way, spirituality one way, neuroscience one way, the 3 minds may be another way. So as long as we're aware that within a particular context it could change. And let's not be restricted to a very strict definition, because none of these can really be restricted, right? What we're talking about fundamentally is the dissolution of boundaries. So let's not be too strict with our definitions, but precise enough that we know what we are mapping out. And bliss in particular, I would be careful about, because is consciousness bliss? In some ways, yes, but bliss, there's a range to bliss, right? There's the ecstatic bliss of the mind being blown, right? When the mind is completely blown, there is a feeling of bliss, joy from all sides, right? Inside, outside, left, right, top, down, all of these get obliterated. And there's just bliss. Now, that may not be the same in the same context as consciousness in some contexts, because consciousness as it is simply limitlessness, right? It is limitlessness, which is not something that can be conceived, because conception can only happen if there is some kind of perimeter. So this limitlessness coming into some kind of experience is what we call bliss. So as long as that is understood, generally speaking, the answer is yes. Awareness, consciousness, timeless, formless existence, bliss. Do we start to realize this more as we shift our attention as the boundary of the first mind starts to thin and we realize more fully the second mind? Yes. And I don't think we need to explain that much. It's very clearly put. As the attention shifts, meaning as the boundary dissolves, meaning the second mind is recognized more and more, then the meaning of these words of ecstasy or bliss or limitlessness comes to the forefront. You stated we can still function fully in the physical world from the second mind, as in second mind medicine. Can you elaborate on this? We can still function fully in the physical world as the second mind. As the second mind, the physical world is recognized as physical as the first mind. When identity is configured in the first mind orientation, then the world appears physical, right? As the second mind, that very physicality is recognized differently, right? There's no real word for what it is. We can say it's mental. It may be easily misunderstood, but it is a living, ongoing process is what we call the world, right? Even the furniture or the concrete slab, the cinder block, these things that appear so dead to the first mind are in fact lively processes. Even at the atomic level, we recognize this. At the subatomic and the quantum level, they're constantly processings. They're not so much things as they are processings. So there is an aliveness and a constant processing, which is what we call the world as the second mind. So can we still fully function in the physical world? We're still fully functioning. However, that world that is being functioned in is not restricted to the world of the first mind. The world that the first mind recognizes is a fraction of the world. Only a fraction of the world is recognized as the first mind. So that second mind can still function because its own nature is what is appearing as the world. Right? So that dissonance isn't there. That rift isn't there between the world and the individual. All right. Quick question from Marcia. Which level of this talking is related to anxiety? So anxiety is primarily of the first mind. It's created by the boundary. Please go back and check the previous talks. If you go to anoopkumar.com/videos, then the prior talks are there, and I specifically discuss anxiety in one of the previous talks. Last question. Why is fundamental consciousness producing its own experiences through us? Why does it want to experience itself? Now, this idea that consciousness wants to experience itself is a kind of storifying about consciousness. It's a storying, right? It's creating a narrative around consciousness, that consciousness wants to express itself and therefore the world appears. I would say that it is of the nature of consciousness, being of the nature of infiniteness, that a world can be perceived. Let's look at it like this. If we look at water, water appears as ocean, appears as droplet, appears as wave, appears as waterfall, appears as cloud, appears as lake, brook, stream, river, and so on, right? Endless forms. It appears as a glass of water, the water in the glass. Now, can we say that water produces the ocean? Does water produce the lake? No. Because water has the innate potential of expressing in almost any way. It can express as ocean. It can express as lake. It can express as so many infinite forms, right? It can. And then based on the conditions, it just expresses. It is not trying to be an ocean. It doesn't want to experience an ocean. It doesn't want to experience a raindrop. Water is water, right? Now, even water, which can take infinite forms, if water can do that, what to say of consciousness itself? Consciousness is the infinity of infinities. What does this mean? Consciousness is the infinity of infinities. See, if we say, how many thoughts are there in the world? The answer has to be infinity, right? There's no number of thoughts because there are always more thoughts. If we say, how many forms are there in the world? The answer has to be infinity. Because you cannot count the number of forms and say, yes, there are 7 trillion forms. No, there's always another form. So infinity, there are infinite forms, there are infinite colors, there are infinite ideas, there are infinite expressions. That means there are so many infinities. But you will see that all of these infinities are restricted in some way. They are finite infinities, right? If you say how many objects are there, then that infinity is restricted to form. It's a finite infinity because objects have a restriction in space, right? So these infinities still have restrictions. How many thoughts are there? Infinite thoughts. However, those thoughts are still restricted to the nature of thought. So these are finite infinities. Consciousness is that which is not restricted by even time and space. It is boundlessness, limitlessness. And so this consciousness is in and of itself absolute creative potential and can create, can express in innumerable infinite ways. So it is not that consciousness wants to experience itself. Its very nature of effervescent creativity is what allows for there to be what we are calling experience at the first and second mind level. Has consciousness changed? No. Just as water does not change when we see an ocean. Water does not change as a lake. Water does not change as a droplet. Water does not change as a waterfall. Water is water, and water is water alone. It is only when the attention is on the particular form of it that we call it something else, like a waterfall. And similarly, consciousness is ever undifferentiated. Because of its creative potency, it is as though experienced, as though forms, because the attention and the configuration of the mind is attracting, is engaging at that level. All right, so it is not that fundamental consciousness is producing its own experiences. Its fundamental nature is creative potency. Why does it want to experience itself? It's not that it wants to experience itself. As simply what we say as a way of developing a narrative around consciousness. It is as it is. And it is not even an it. Consciousness is not an it. It is not a particularity. These are the questions from last week. Profound questions. Let's just take a minute to begin chapter 2 of Is This a Dream? Chapter 2 is Love Shining. And we'll just read the first sentence. Love is at the root of what we are. The first sentence is love is at the root of what we are. And this is especially relevant for those who are asking about the dark night, who are asking about what are called bad thoughts, who are asking about the notion of perfection, of getting away from the I, losing the first mind. Love is at the root of what we are. Meaning that the very wellspring of love is part and parcel of every human being. There is no human being that does not have access to infinite love. I realize that it is not always experienced. I realize that it can feel like love is not here. I'm not denying that. I'm simply saying that love is very close, very intimate, part and parcel of what you are. And not just a bit of love or a trickle of love. The very fountainhead of love is within you. There is no doubt about this. Now, when there are beliefs and stories that we've been given from people who themselves did not feel this love, then that can create a film which prevents this love from being felt. A film of self-judgments. I should be like this, right? I should have gotten this degree. I should have had this job. I should have been like this person. I should have been like my brother or my sister. I should be more spiritual. I should be making more money. All of these are first mind stories. And if we believe them too much, then it's almost like the system says, well, these are the thoughts that are being selected. These are the stories that are being selected, and that kind of becomes the experience. But if one says, no, you know what? So many people have said this, that love is at the root of what I am. Maybe I'm not experiencing it. Still, it is true. Right? This is not a harmful thing to recognize or to consider, that even if I'm not experiencing, maybe there is still love here. Even that consideration can start to open up the faucet. Even considering that, yes, even though I'm not feeling this love, maybe it is here. Maybe it's just that I'm not feeling it. Maybe all these self-judgments aren't working. Even staying with that consideration will start to shift the beliefs and open the faucet. Love is always here. Let's spend a few moments together. Please do, if you have the book, please do post a review on Amazon and check out the Chopra Well membership. Go to YouTube, Chopra Well, and join the membership. And we will start Gems of Ancient India next week. And I will also see you here next Wednesday. We'll dive more into love shining. This has been an exploration of the question, is this a dream?